Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sci Cam. We've been away for a bit. We had our live show at the Cambridge Science Festival, but we're back to normal with the Google Plus Hangouts, and hopefully we'll be returning to our standard monthly schedule. I'm Michael Contario, and joining me this month are Sonny Dunbar
Hello!
and Robin Lamble.
Hello.
And we're going to start with Robin, just in case his tenuous connection falls out. So, Robin, what are you talking about today?
I was going to talk about how computers can be used to generate music. Music is possibly one of the most algorithmic of the arts. There's an awful lot of very explicit mathematics in the relationship between different notes, and you have pieces of music that quite explicitly use relationships such as the Fibonacci numbers and things like that, symmetry, things like that, which computers are very good at modeling. And in fact, it turns out that the first, what you could call algorithmic music, that is, music that could be generated by a computer, significantly predates computers, because in the 1700s there were musical dice games, which is where people would have several different bars of music, and you would roll your dice and pick a bar based on this, and there would be rules for which bars you could pick after which. But the style of music that they had is sufficiently rigid that basically there are only a few options that you have, and otherwise everything is basically set in place. Some of these are attributed to Mozart, attributed to Haydn, and although most of the published ones we're not actually sure they really were responsible for writing, they definitely did have some things which Mozart definitely would have played this game, because we have pieces of his work where you can see he's written bars like this. But in general, you probably wouldn't consider this creative, because you definitely need a situation where the composer has really already written all the music, and then a random number generator just generates a few random rejigging of music that's already been written. But since the 50s, which is actually the same decade that computers began to actually play music electronically, we also began to see noise generated by computers. We also began to see the first of the musics composed purely by an actual computer, the Iliac Suite by Hiller and Isaacson of the University of Illinois in 1957. So this started off as just some random notes, which isn't really much of a composition, then increasingly went into using more of these quite rigid rules for the particular style of music that was popular around the time of Mozart, just imposing more and more of these rules until you end up with something that's entirely quite rigid and actually is not that much randomness in it at all. But equivalently, you do need someone who knows these rules to very explicitly program them into the computer, so you sort of have to ask whether it really was just the programmer who could have just written it himself. But more recently, algorithms have really become quite a lot more sophisticated and very much could be written by non-musicians. So you can have different, either you program in the rules explicitly, or you can comb existing works of music for what are the rules that make them work. You can search through the complete works of Bach, for instance, and try and work out what makes something sound like Bach rather than some other composer. So this sort of thing has also gone on for several decades now, and for at least a short period of time you can pass blind hearing tests for people to not realize that this work actually comes from a computer, as opposed to it's a very little known piece of work by Bach. The primary sort of motive force behind this for a long time has been David Cope, who wrote the Experiments in Musical Intelligence, or EMI program, which created a number of different styles of music, from classical to jazz, and also he is a composer himself and composed his own works via this programming this computer to model his own works, which has quite successfully and in very genuine sense been then doing his work. He also composed a entirely new individual with a new style of music called Emily Howell. So if you see any music by Emily Howell, it is just a computer. You probably can tell, to be honest, because these programs are not necessarily that perfect yet. But you know, it's getting better. You can now download apps which will generate melodies for you on your iPhone, Android, whatever it is that you want, and these will have various different types of approaches to generating music. So one of the upcoming types of computer learning techniques is called genetic algorithms. So these take some basic input and then rejig it to make a new thing and then test that thing according to some criteria. So this applies to many different types of things, but in music you need to have a beauty criteria. So the big problem is you need to teach your computer what beauty is. And this is a problem because we don't entirely know what beauty is yet. And as of yet, we've not perfectly solved this problem. So most of the time what we do is have a combination of take a basic input, can be anything. You can take a protein sequence, some DNA, any random information basically. That generates some music. You then mutate that music. You operate on it in some way that just randomly changes bits of it. You compare the new random bits of it to say, you know, this note is dissonant. You don't want to do that here. This bit is something else is wrong with it. Let's not do that. So you get rid of the ones which don't work, and you keep changing the ones which do until they work as well as you can. Then compare how beautiful it is according to your computer. But at the moment, you then also need to have a human, which is then another level of selection. And the human says, no, actually, this is not really what I think is beautiful. So this is then called interactive genetic algorithms, because a human basically at the end has to go, not really, no. But some of these can be quite pleasant. So is this, I guess, where music is going? Or is this just a sort of fad for the moment because we can tell computers to do this? So it's something we're going to have to wait and see to what extent programming computers to do musicians' work for them is going to erode the jobs of musicians. At the moment, it's not entirely convincing. You can listen to some computer-generated music on YouTube. There are loads of videos of it. Most of them are quite entertaining for about 10 seconds and then either become weird or just don't really go anywhere. But for a short period of time, yeah, you can actually make something that you'd be perfectly happy listening to as background music in a computer game or so. So yeah, it actually could be useful to have a computer game with computer-generated background music that entertains you for all of the time, just in case you're getting bored. There we go. That's what I have for this week. Okay.
Oh, so it sounds like they're almost at the level of making music rather than anything that we'd really classify as actually good music.
Yes, on the whole, it's either very odd if you have sort of very highly mathematical things. So in the same way that computers are very good at generating fractals, so images where you've got some particular symmetry condition, you can zoom in on a visual fractal and it looks the same, and you can zoom out again. So if you give it very basic input, it then has mathematical functions which will generate this very beautiful image. You can do very similar things with noise. You give it a simple input and it mathematically generates some output which kind of has weird symmetries and therefore is kind of beautiful, but it's only beautiful in one particular way. It's something that you can't have like 100 pieces of music like this and you'd want to actually sit and listen to all of them in the same way that you wouldn't go to an art gallery filled entirely with fractal images, even though they are kind of quite nice. So yeah, there's definitely a limit to how much of it you'd want to see at the moment.
Oh, thank you very much, Robin. And if anyone would like to ask any questions about computer-generated music, get in on either the YouTube page or the Google Plus event page that you might be watching this on, and just leave us a comment, and we'll try and get back to those before the end of the show if there are any. Now we're going to move on, and mine is quite different. I'm going into the realm of physics, and this is all kind of inspired by a paper that's come out recently. But to really get into it, I just need to actually go back a bit and talk about lasers and how cool they are, because, well, yeah, everyone likes lasers. And they've got kind of an interesting history, because back when they were made, I think one of the assistants who was helped design the first optical laser described them as a solution in search of a problem. And now, quite a long way down the line, we've got to a situation where not only they were commonplace in CD players and DVD players, but with the people moving to downloads, it seems like that's going out. But now people are more likely to use lasers for communication. There's talk about setting an optical laser link with the International Space Station, for instance, and use it to transmit information like that. So they're kind of common. We just keep on finding more and more uses for them. If you've watched this show for quite a while, in the live show last year, so over a year ago now, I actually talked about a paper about using lasers to guide other light by shooting a square array of lasers, which would kind of heat up the air as they pass through it, causing a change in basically the refractive index, which is kind of like related to how fast the light will pass through that air, and effectively form almost an optic fiber of air, so that any other light you send down the middle of that will be nicely guided. But now we've got a new paper which is actually about using lasers to guide, rather than other light, electricity and electricity sparks. And basically what happens here is the laser, again, heats up the molecules in the air, and actually heats them up so much that their electrons are freed, ionizes them, so it's a bit more of a plasma, but just in a really, really tiny space. And as well as that, also the heating does cause it to expand, and that also slightly changes basically the voltage that you need across it before you actually get a spark happening. And so what this group has done, they're actually a group from everywhere. They've got some people working in Canada, some in Edinburgh, some in China, some in France, Florida. Massive collaboration here. And they've decided to use this just to demonstrate guiding of a spark. But as well as kind of like the normal sort of laser beams where most of the energy is right in the center, which are Gaussian, it's kind of like mostly in the center and kind of just tails off towards the end. There are also other kinds of laser beam called airy beams and Bessel beams, which again are types which we've only really been able to make in the last about 10 years or so, where these beams have the weird property that, well, firstly, airy beams can bend. You think of light just going straight, but no, you can make a laser beam which will just naturally bend, which is bizarre on its own. But also they tend to get known as self-healing, which means that if there's an obstacle in the way, if part of the beam can get past it without going through it, then the shape of the beam will tend to reform around the other side. Just because in these beams you've got, basically the mathematical construct is such that you've got lots of the energy a lot more distributed around the beam, and as it's going along, it's kind of reinforcing itself. So when you lose a bit of it, it doesn't matter so much. It kind of almost, in some case, yeah, it just kind of reformed itself a bit weaker on the other side. And if you can do this with your laser beams, you can control where the ionization of the molecules in the air is going to happen. And so you can also do this with your spark. And so there's some wonderful pictures that sadly I can't show in the Science magazine of these electrical discharges, which normally are random. If you think of, say, lightning, which actually this resembles quite a bit, you get the random paths, and obviously coming from the clouds to the ground, you've got quite a big path to go. So it can go in lots of different directions. You get the really impressive kind of forking going on. Whereas actually they were just looking at over a gap of about 1 centimeter. So it still jiggled about a bit, because it had to go between two electrodes which were quite close. It was just jiggling about almost straight. But they've demonstrated that by using a normal laser beam, they can get it much, much straighter. And then by using these airy and Bessel beams, they can actually get it to bend such that if you imagine putting something directly in between where you'd expect the spark to go, by firing one of these beams so that they can actually make the spark curve around this, so there's no line of sight between the start and the end of this spark, which is amazing. It's one of those things like it's not in any way something that we can use straight off. It's something they're going to have to develop, they're going to have to work on, but it might be useful for ionizing bits of the air, making sure that we can effectively guide lightning strikes in the future, maybe. That might actually be a possibility. And even if we can't manage that sort of thing, that sort of large scale, just for being able to, like, arc welding, being able to have better control over where the spark goes, various manufacturing processes, it would be useful to be able to control that. And now with these lasers, that's possible. But I kind of went in a bit further and looked into these area beams and vessel beams a bit more, and to look into how they're created. And sometimes it's using a spatial light modulator, which is an interesting bit of kit that has become a lot more prominent in physics and optical physics recently. And that's kind of quite complicated, so I won't go into it too much. But there's another paper from a few years ago where effectively they're using sound to shape these laser beams. And in this case, they've got basically a small cavity with water, ordinary water in there, and some little actuators on the sides they can vibrate. And so they can set up inside the water areas where it's denser, areas where it's less dense. And that causes the light that's going through it to bend and refract in different ways. And by doing this carefully enough, they can get one of these vessel beams that I've just been talking about. So it's entirely feasible that at some point in the future, we'll go on to using sound to control light, to control electricity. And I know that sounds just like a stupid Rube Goldberg machine, but I think that's pretty cool, and yeah, it's quite impressive. So yeah, any questions from either of you? Robin, you appear to be muted.
Am I now unmuted?
You are now unmuted, yes.
Excellent. Technical excellence here. So I was just wondering whether what it is that actually makes the beams bend. Is it how you set the beam up, or do you have to have something going on in the air in order to get them to bend?
No, it's how you set the beam up. And yeah, that particular one is an airy beam. The vessel beam is a slightly different one. And yes, you set it carefully, and the beams just are free to accelerate. And of course, because we're dealing with light, we're not expecting the acceleration to actually be a change in the speed. It's a change in their direction. But yeah, it's all to do with the mathematical properties of the wavefront. And you can't get a perfect one, because the thing about these beams is that they're kind of all inspired by effectively mathematical functions that we've known about for quite a long time. But it's only relatively recently that people have gone, can we actually make one of those in real life? And it turns out that we've reached a state where we do have the technology for it. And the other thing about these is you don't tend to get much dispersion of the beam over a long distance. And as I say, all of the ones that we've made are not true airy beams or true vessel beams, because in order to actually make one that's true, you actually have to have it going over basically all space. And so you obviously can't do that. But we can make really good approximations to it, so that over the sort of distances that we actually care about, we're not going to get it disappearing off in different directions. It's just going to follow this nice path. And interestingly, the airy beams, the shape of the path that it follows is a parabola, which people will probably be quite familiar with, because that's the same sort of path that a thrown ball will go in the absence of air resistance. But yes, it's that nice that nice curve that you get when you throw a ball under the force of gravity. So yeah, they're really cool and really impressive. There's so much that has been done with light recently, with these spatial light modulators. There's all interesting stuff about light having different kinds of angular momentum in a way that people didn't think was possible not that long ago. And that people are just kind of like, they're going, oh, we can actually do this, and they're now trying to look for things that they can they're useful. So we've gone from lasers being the solution in search of a problem to all of these other effects being solutions in search of problems. And while I doubt that any of them will be quite as versatile as lasers have turned out to be, it's quite exciting to see what we actually get. So thank you very much. And Sonia, what have you got for us this week? This month? That'd be crazy. And kind of don't think we can keep these up every week. That'd be a lot of effort.
So I have a use of light by plants. I'm going to be talking about the history of one of our most useful crops, wheat. You've almost certainly eaten it in some form or another, possibly not if you're gluten intolerant, but with our world population standing at a staggering 7 billion people and counting, there are a lot of mouths to feed at the moment. And about 2/3 of the calories that we consume globally are provided by just 3 main crops. Rice being one of them, maize, and wheat. Wheat alone accounts for about 20%. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is how we've changed wheat to make it better, effectively, for farming and for the purpose that we use it for, which is feeding people. Because while you might not realize it, all of our major crop plants have been domesticated by farmers that have selected for desirable traits, much in the same way as we've done with, say, dogs and cats. Only if you look at a wild relative of wheat, you might not be able to tell the difference immediately between that and one of our farmed ones, whereas a wolf and, say, a Labrador are a little bit more obvious. So, bread wheat, which is a scientific name Triticum aestivum, is the most common species of wheat that we currently grow. It accounts for about 95% of the total wheat crop. This particular species was domesticated about 9,000 years ago. So wheat's been around a long time. And it was domesticated in an area of land that would have then been called Mesopotamia. Nowadays, we know it as the area in Iraq, Kuwait, some parts of Syria, a bit of Turkey, and some of Iran. And it's basically the area of land between 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it's part of what we've referred to over the years as the Fertile Crescent, largely because it was an area that had good water supply and a wealth of natural resources, which combined to allow human civilization and technology to flourish. So our wheat was one of those fantastic natural resources. A little bit more genetic detail on it now. So bread wheat is actually hexaploid. So that means it has 6 sets of each of its chromosomes. They're actually organized into 3 pairs of 7 chromosomes in total. To contrast this then, humans, us, we're diploid. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46. As a result of being hexaploid, the genome of wheat is staggeringly large. It stands at about 16,000 megabases, give or take some. The human genome, in comparison, is about 2,600 megabases. So we're talking about a lot of extra genetic material. But where did all these extra chromosomes come from? Well, it's a result of how this particular species arose. It started with 2 diploid wild ancestors of our wheat, and they were able to hybridize to form a tetraploid. So this had 4 instead of 2. And this species is known as Triticum turgidum, and it then hybridized again with another diploid. The diploid in this case was a hardy species of something known as goat grass, and it provided in particular one very useful feature to our bread wheat, and that was a greater tolerance to cold, which is very useful when we expanded the range that wheat was grown across. So from that set of 3 diploids comes each of the 3 pairs of chromosomes that we see. And it's been shown that although they contain very similar genes, they contain subtly different copies of each of them. And if you remove any given pair, you'll see a slightly different effect on your bread wheat. But it does pose an interesting challenge. If you're trying to reproduce with 6 sets of all of your chromosomes, it's a little bit unwieldy. And very conveniently, there happens to be a dedicated set of genes seen in our wheat that seems to be deliberately there to control this process. These genes are slightly modified forms of cyclin-dependent kinases. So normally these control the cell cycle, and it's probably what they're doing in this case too. It's thought actually that they slightly extend it, and that would give the chromosomes a little bit extra time to be a bit more fussy, make sure they get the perfect partner. Because without doing that, you'd end up with all sorts of strange mutants, and we don't necessarily want the traits that they have. We might though, but for the most part, I think we've got a pretty good bread wheat right now. And early farmers were really very lucky, because it just so happened that this set of genes arose before the tetraploid even occurred. It might even have made it possible. So it is in all of our cultivated wheats, which is very useful. Now, it's not just bread wheat that we grow, and some of the species along the way were actually used in agriculture. Starting with one of the diploids, we grew something called einkorn wheat. But that got superseded when the tetraploids came along, and there are two main cultivated forms of this tetraploid wheat, one of which we call Emma wheat, which isn't so common today, and the other is Durham wheat, which is actually still used today, largely to make pasta, because it is one of the hardest wheats. If you think of your spaghetti, a lot harder than the wheat we see in breads and things like that. So I've mentioned that we've got cultivated forms of these wheats, and they are subtly different. Again, we've got more features chosen just to make them particularly useful to farmers. One of the features that's been seen in all of the cultivated varieties of our wheat is something known as a tougher rachis. So if you imagine your little stalk of wheat, it has all the grains attached. The bit that it's attached by is known as the rachis. And normally that would become brittle, snap, and all the grains would be released onto the ground to be dispersed. That's not very useful if you want to collect the grains. And so farmers managed to select for some plants that had a much tougher connection and didn't break, so your grain stayed intact, so you could harvest your whole plant. It made life much easier. A feature that's seen in bread wheat but not in Emma wheat or Durham wheat is that they've managed to select for a slightly changed husk as well. So normally your grain of wheat, the soft part that you want to sort of grind and use as flour, is protected by a very hard husk, and you have to mill this and grind it off in Emma wheat. Whereas in our bread wheat, it comes away a lot easier and can actually be lost in the process of you removing the grains from the main stalk, which is very handy. The final change I'm going to talk about is shown in a picture here, which I should hopefully be able to show you. Here we go. So this is a photo taken in the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge, and it is a row planted with lots of different varieties of wheat. I don't know if you can just about see the black tags along the front of the wheat, sort of on the left, but they are telling you when a new variety of wheat starts. And the big difference you can hopefully see is that at the back of this row of wheat, it's a lot taller. And as you come closer to the camera, it actually gets quite a bit shorter. I just go back now. There we go. So the pioneer of this change in height was someone known as Norman Borlaug, and he developed varieties of high-yield, semi-dwarf wheat in Mexico. And it was this robust wheat that allowed Mexico to become self-sufficient in wheat by 1956, which was very useful for them. And this crop was particularly useful because shorter wheat is less likely to fall over, less likely to become then damaged and ruined, so your crops are much more resilient. The other advantage is that by reducing height, the plants aren't putting as much energy into the stalk. So we don't actually use the stalk for much. We want the grains. And if they have the energy left over and the nutrients left over, they invest a little bit more in their seeds. So we get better grain as well. And it was this work that led to Norman Borlaug in 1970 being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work improving the global agricultural situation. And his work was part of what we know as the Green Revolution, which achieved much needed crop yields worldwide. But we must bear in mind that the world population has doubled again since those fertilizers and pesticides and the new cultivars came to save the day and solve the potential hunger crisis back in the 1960s. The race is on again to try and further improve our crops. We need plant scientists today to create a second green revolution to continue to feed the world. So whether that involves making them more resilient to environmental stresses or protecting them against pests, all sorts of things. We need some ideas to feed the world. So I'm afraid I've just posed a problem rather than a solution, and I don't think that lasers can solve this one.
No, sadly not. Oh, but very interesting. I love the fact that smaller stalks are better because it makes them less likely to fall over. All the high-tech things that we've got in the world, and we're worried about our plants falling over.
Yep. Well, normally they grow up and up to compete for light, but we don't really want them to do that. We'll just keep them all exactly the same height, and that's fine.
Oh, yes, and also it's interesting just like thinking about where wheat comes from, because it seems to be such a, well, it just seems to be such a normal thing. We don't think of like how far across the world it's come to be in the UK and become a staple of our food here.
Well, arguably corn and rice have come even further. And it's interesting because I think it's something like 16 major crops basically dominate global supermarkets. So it sort of doesn't matter which country you're in now, you'll see similar products wherever you go. Which is slightly a shame because we're losing some of the sort of regional variety. But it's a nice reflection of how globalized our world has become.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Sonia. One comment I had on my stuff talking about lasers is that I possibly wasn't clear enough on how the lasers were actually guiding the electricity, and it's just that the lasers are causing the ionization of the molecules in the air, so the electrons are freer. The electrons is turning it into a plasma. I believe in the paper they say that in some locations, I believe it goes up to about 50,000 degrees Kelvin, effectively, which obviously is very hot in terms of stripping the electrons out. And those electrons are then free to move, which means that when you've got your potential across them, the electricity is going to go in that direction rather than trying to go off in a different direction. So yeah, that's the key point there. I'm sorry for not making that clearer. Any comments on either of the other talks there, Robin?
I was just wondering, so that can't really be terribly energy efficient because lasers are generally not terribly well absorbed by air, and so if the amount of it that is absorbed by air is heating things to several thousand Kelvin, that must take a lot of energy.
Yes, I'm trying to check this, but yes, I think they're trying to use things with laser beams with. They say the peak intensity of the pulse reaches nearly 10 to the power of 14 watts per centimeter squared, and remains fairly constant over about 10 centimeters. So that's what 100 million watts of energy in about that big. I say watts of energy, that's naughty. Watts of power. What is a unit of power, not of energy? But yes, that's a lot of energy passing through that per second, which is why these things are only lasting for a millionth of a million, like a few tens of millionths of a millionth of a second. So yes, you don't leave it there for long, because yes, it does have a very high power, and yes, it will. It's possibly not the not the best thing, but yes, they say a temperature increase of the order of about 50,000 Kelvin is what they've worked out for that. So it doesn't stay that hot for long. Anyway, that's the end of this week. I keep saying that. This is the end of this month's Sci Cam. If you enjoyed it, do subscribe to us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. And if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, feel free to add any questions there, and we'll try and get back to you too. And we'll hopefully be back sometime in July with another episode and some brand new topics. So thank you to Robin and Sonia.
Thank you.
No.
And thank you for watching. Bye-bye.